Continue, please, in this last segment to take care of yourself. If you need drinks, if you need to take a break, if you need to go, please do that. Yeah, that's right. And also continue, if you have questions, to feel free. I've been talking a lot, which is my tendency, and there's a lot to cover. So there's some unavoidable nature of that as well, but please don't hesitate to bring your questions, interact. And if you have questions that you don't ask today, but that come up later, I'm not going anywhere, and I love this kind of stuff, so ask me anytime.
That shows.
If we weren't talking, we wouldn't know who you were.
All right.
Jesus talks in Revelation.
So we're gonna, for the last segment here, try to offer some context toward the end of this process of writing the New Testament, particularly looking at Revelation as an example of that, because it's one of the very last texts, both chronologically when it was written, and it is the last text in our New Testament for a reason. So we're gonna use that as a way to frame that. If we understand these sort of early texts as a time when Christians saw no separation between themselves and Jews, really, that they were part of the Jewish community and that they were also trying to survive in the Roman imperial environment, carve out places for them to have their own communities where they did not live like Romans, where they lived different from Romans. They shared property, women were equals, women could teach and all of that sort of stuff. They were distinct from Romans, but they were mostly just trying to survive, not to resist or oppose Roman oppression quite to the idea. And then we understood with the 70s and 80s that there had become this understanding that due to Rome destroying the temple and such, that there was revealed in Christ a way to oppose Roman power, that Christ's ministry and particularly his death and resurrection proved that Rome's power was not invincible, that it was an empty illusion, that God's power was more significant and the power of love could overcome Rome's power of death, and that therefore there was a way to carve out not just communities that were trying to survive, but communities which were actually resisting Roman power by their very existence. Then we see at the end some of these texts trying to deal with the consequences of living in opposition to the major imperial power of your time. One thing that is understood by Christian tradition is that 11 of the 12 original apostles were martyred, died violent deaths. We don't have concrete historical records for all of them because it just was 2,000 years ago and we don't have concrete historical records for all of them. Some of these things are based on popular traditions, which may or may not have a great deal of basis in historical fact. But by church tradition and by the best records we have available, Peter was crucified upside down. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross. James was executed by the sword. Thomas was killed by a spear. Bartimaeus was flayed or skinned alive. Like the apostles were almost all of them violently executed by the state for their proclamation. And this tradition, even if the tradition isn't necessarily always entirely based in absolute historical fact, partly came about in this time period because this was a community that was defining itself as a community living under Roman oppression and living in resistance to Roman oppression. The reason why the church teaches that the apostles were all executed is because if your community's identity is following a man who was executed by Rome as proof that Rome doesn't have any power and that death has no power over you, then it's natural that then all the leaders and teachers of your movement follow suit. That they are further proof that of this. Peter was executed upside down supposedly because he said, "I was not worthy to be killed in the same manner as my Savior," so he asked that his cross be inverted as to say, I don't deserve to die the same way that Jesus died there. And the point of this story is to show you that from his point of view, death was not something to be feared. He has the calmness of state of mind facing execution to say, hey, would you mind doing it for me in a novel way? Would you mind, changing it up a little bit? The reason for this is to highlight that he believes that death had no power, right? The reason in Acts why Stephen, who is martyred, Stephen, who's one of the early deacons, is martyred, the reason that Stephen gives a big old speech during his martyrdom, and it says while he's being stoned to death that he was praying for forgiveness for the people who were stoning him, is to show that, like Christ, that death was not a frightening thing for him, that he wasn't afraid of death, that death had no power over him, and that was part of it. Because this community, this was how they were beginning to understand their relationship to Rome. Now, this relationship to Rome was, Rome fully did believe it had power over them and was continually attempting to try to prove that it had power over them in exercising said power through the power of not just imperial occupation, but through execution of people who they deemed as politically inconvenient for Roman rule. So you can see this, in the early church did see this as a kind of spiritual contest. Rome saying, we're going to prove to you that our power is real. You're going to believe it because we're going to show you. And the church saying, we're going to keep proving to you that you have no power over us because you can't make us afraid of you. Even when you do terrible things, we don't fear you. We continue living in resistance to you despite your oppression. We don't change. We don't become like you when you do this. Naturally, this conflict between two powers trying to prove the other is not more powerful than them, it's one that creates tension. And one of the strongest tensions in the early churches was basically the question of how long. Like, if the disciples were saying, okay, Rome is going to any day fall apart under its own weight, its own power, like the pigs, it's going to run into the sea and be destroyed. Its power of death ultimately is empty, and even though they can't hurt us, they do hurt themselves every time they exercise this power of death. They undermine themselves. Ultimately, Rome is doomed. Well, naturally, the question coming from believers would be, cool, how long till that happens? Like, how long do we have to keep this up? How many of us have to die in, heroic martyrdom deaths before the thing you keep saying is going to happen is actually going to happen? And that was the question that at the end of this century was most prominent in Christian community minds, was this question of, like, we've seen a lot of martyrs now. A lot of people have followed Jesus' footsteps and have been, just like him. They died faithful deaths. They proclaimed forgiveness to the people who were killing them. They showed that Rome's power of death is empty. But also, when do we get to stop dying? Was a big question looming. And that's the question that's really behind Revelation. So I said, by tradition, 11 of the 12 apostles died martyred in this. There was one who did not, John. John is understood to have been the only one who died of old age. He died, supposedly, in exile on the island of Patmos. In other words, he was arrested by the Romans for writing seditious letters, writing seditious texts, encouraging Christians not to worship Caesar and things like that. And he was sent into exile on the island of Patmos. Why he got exile instead of execution, we don't know. But he was living on this little island off the coast of modern-day Turkey. Patmos is just a tiny little island, living off the coast of Turkey. And he was basically in house arrest. He wasn't in a prison, but his guards were Roman centurions, And all of the things he wrote were read by his they read them before they got taken to the coast, which meant, of course, that he had to be careful with what he was writing. He couldn't write things that were, he couldn't just write, hey, everybody, any day now, Caesar's gonna, fail and the Roman Empire is gonna collapse and all these Roman centurions that have got their boots on our neck, they're gonna regret having supported Rome. He couldn't very well just write that to his community because the Roman centurions would never have passed it on. They would have just been like, torn it up and been like, nope. This is why you're in exile, John. You don't get to write things like that anymore as part of that. So John wrote a text called Revelation, which is one of the weirdest texts in the Bible. It has all kinds of crazy imagery in it. It has all kinds of metaphors and images of things which have at various times by different groups been taken in different ways, sometimes in literal ways that don't make a lot of sense in my mind, but it's understandable that it is come up with all these interpretations because the text is quite out there in terms of what it has in it. So much so that it was controversial whether or not to include it in Scripture. When the bishops were gathered in 325 at the Council of Nicaea debating what texts to put into what we call the New Testament, Revelation was the last one decided upon and put at the end. Remember, they ordered them in order of theological importance. They thought Revelation it barely made the cut. It's not, many of them were like, this book is suspect. I'm not sure it really is true. The thing that got it in was the belief that it was written by one of the original apostles. So that was the argument of like, well, if John wrote it, I don't know, John was on some crazy mushrooms at the end of his life there, but John, it was John, so I guess we kind of have to. He's one of the original 12. So, we kind of gotta let him sneak this one by. That was the general attitude at council. There were a number of bishops who openly spoke out about how this text is going to mislead people. It's not a helpful text. We should not include it. Martin Luther in the Reformation hated it. He wanted to cut it out. Not just Revelation. He wanted to cut a couple books out. But Revelation, he also thought it was terrible. So it has a storied tradition of being controversial, this text, of whether it was there. The reason it was included is because supposedly John wrote it, and John gets to write what he wants to write because he's one of the original 12. But when we try to understand, perhaps with a historical critical lens, what John is doing in this text, we can see why it was valuable to the early church and why it still is relevant to us as well. And what these questions and how it ties in with what I was talking about with Rome. So John is in exile. He's not allowed to write just whatever he wants to write. He has to write things that his captors will approve, which either means he writes things that are innocuous, harmless, that they don't care about, or he somehow hides his message in some way that they don't recognize, but that his readers will. In other words, writing in a kind of code, writing in a kind of hidden double meaning, layered meaning of what he's writing about. And so John writes about a series of visions that he has. And the visions are wild and would seem like nonsense to most people without a lot of other context to offer some explanation behind what those visions mean. Notably, he relies for context on metaphors drawn from the Hebrew Bible, from the Jewish scriptures, because he is still writing to a community that understands itself as Jewish, even at the end of this first century, and his captors aren't familiar with the Hebrew Bible and don't know the Hebrew Bible, so they're not going to get these metaphors, they're not going to get these images, they're not going to understand them. So he can sort of sneak the messages past his captors to his audience and hope that his audience gets it. And some of these messages, you know, in chapter 18 of Revelation, for example, John says, he's describing another vision he's having. I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his splendor. He called out with a mighty voice, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. It has become a dwelling place of demons, a haunt of every foul spirit. A haunt of every foul bird, a haunt of every foul and hateful beast. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxury. Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, so that you do not take part in her sins, and so that you do not share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her as she herself is rendered, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double draught for her in the cup she mixed. And it goes on for a ways about basically how terrible Babylon is and all the things that God is going to do to Babylon. Now, Babylon, by this time, was like not even a capital city of a major country. It was a backwater of a small area. There, even the rulers that ruled in that territory anymore had moved their capital to another city. So Babylon, though it had an ancient history of being powerful, was no longer significant or powerful in this time. And so this would have just seemed like nonsense to the Roman captors. He's writing about something that just doesn't make any sense. But in the context of the Hebrew Bible, Babylon is the biggest, most dramatic enemy of the house of David, of Judea. Babylon is the one that, most importantly, sacked and destroyed the first temple. In other words, he's writing to you about, the ones that destroyed the temple. The guys that destroyed the temple. You know who I mean, everybody? The ones who destroyed the temple? Those people, bad stuff is going to happen to them. God's not on their side, just so you know. To those who have familiarity with Hebrew scriptures, this is pretty obvious. But to those without any familiarity with the Hebrew scriptures, it just sounds like he's just talking about some random thing that doesn't mean anything to them as there. So in other words, John is layering metaphors purposefully to hide his meaning from one group, but share his meaning with the other group. And in these metaphors and stories, in these meanings, largely what he is telling this other community is basically, don't worry about me. I mean, naturally they'd be worried about him. Don't worry about me. Yes, I'm captive. Yes, I'm trapped right now. Yes, they've got me. And yes, they killed all of my colleagues at some point. Maybe they might even kill me, but ultimately, we're going to win this fight. We're going to win this fight not, again, through literal armies, through actual conquest, but through a spiritual unveiling of the fact that Rome has, it's the Wizard of Oz, that there's no there, there's no actual power there, that their power is a big illusion. It's a big fiction they put on everyone. They've made you all scared of their power of death, but once you realize that death has no power over you, then they also have no power over you, and that this is ultimately doomed. Those who believe in the power of death, this is what's going to happen to them. And he goes into great length describing all of the terrible things that are going to happen to people who believe in the power of death. And those descriptions of things that are going to happen to the people who believe in the power of death, those who worship Babylon, or who worship the beast of Babylon, who is another metaphor that he brings up. He is borrowing from the book of Daniel. Daniel has references the empires of Persia and Assyria and Babylon as beasts, as three distinct beasts, and references those beasts as people that are devouring the Jews, the people of Israel at that time. And so he's referencing Daniel, and he combines all of these beasts into one mega beast that has a bunch of horns and a bunch of eyes and heads, and it's this crazy dragon that's going to come that's devouring everyone. But he's referencing empires that oppressed the people of Israel before and comparing to the empire that is currently oppressing the people of Israel and saying, just like God didn't let those empires last, God's not going to let this one last. And usually they collapse under the weight of their own oppression, under their own oppressive, destructive powers, ultimately destroy themselves. He's writing to comfort people who are scared and who are maybe not sure if they're going to how long they can keep this up. Not sure if they're going to keep on believing, after so much a death, if they're going to keep on believing what they're being told to believe, which is that Jesus has made the power of death empty, powerless over you, and that if you just follow Christ in his way, then, God will assure you life that extends beyond this life, and that, you'll be freed from these oppressive structures. That's a hard thing to believe when the evidence of the world around you is saying otherwise, right? That's a hard thing to believe when your friends are getting killed or imprisoned or, otherwise in harsh circumstances. And so John is writing to them to encourage them to believe that. And it's full of these wonderful little surprise reversals. My favorite is toward the end of chapter 13 and the beginning of 14. And this is an example of sure I've got that right section. It's an example of one of those sections that Christians have often interpreted in literalistic ways that maybe I think miss the points.
Is this about the mark on the hand?
All right, sorry, it was actually in chapter 5. It was there. This is the scroll in the lamp. In chapter 5, he's again describing a vision. He says, I saw the right hand of the one seated on the throne, a skull written on the inside and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals? And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look into it. And I began to weep bitterly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. Then one of the elders said to me, do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. Then I saw between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders a lamb standing as if it had been slaughtered, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. He went and took the scroll from the right hand of the one who was seated on the throne. And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song. Right, we'll go into the song there. So here's what's wonderful little reversal about this passage. Is that. So the scroll that is about to be opened in the chapter 4, it says this is God's plan for how he's going to deal with the oppressive powers. This is God's plan for how he's going to deal with the violence in the world. Hint, hint, Rome, but he can't save Rome. So this is how he's going to deal with the beasts in Babylon and things like that. God's plan for how to deal with all that is in this scroll, and you just need to find out what's in the scroll, and you'll be able to know what's going to happen. But no one is able to open the scroll. The scroll, no one can understand it. No one can figure out how to open the scroll. Finally, one who comes along who can open it. The only one. He is the one who has conquered on behalf of God. He is the Lion of Judah. The Lion of Judah is a title that now comes from this text, but now many Christians use to refer to Jesus as they're referring to him as the Lion of Judah. But then he looks at the throne, in the group of people, For the lion, he's like, see, the lion, there he is. He's the one who can open the scroll. Who is he? And he doesn't see a lion. He sees a lamb who was slaughtered.
Yeah.
And the lamb who was slaughtered goes and opens the scroll, thus proving that when they said the Lion of Judah, they meant the lamb. The one who can open the scroll is the lamb who was slaughtered, but this is the trick that's portrayed. You think you're going to get a powerful, mighty, conquering general. Instead, you get a slaughtered lamb, but it turns out that the slaughtered lamb is actually the one who can solve this problem, who reveals the plan for how we're going to defeat the power of oppression. John is always doing this. He's always setting you up going like, oh, it's going to be a big old battle, and then it turns out it's not a battle at all, it's a song. Or it's going to be a big old war between two giant armies, but then when the armies actually get there, they sit down and they don't fight, and they just watch as the commander of the army comes forward and pulls a sword from his mouth, which is his words, and defeats the other side with the sword from his mouth, his words. In other words, the general of the army wins the war with his words. Which, but it's set up like it's a big old war. It's set up like there's two huge armies, and he rides in on a horse, and he pulls a giant sword out. But the sword is his words, and the words are the thing that he actually defeats the other side with. It's constant reversals like this. It's constant twists like this, where John is setting you up to think that you're going to see a big old battle, and then instead of a battle, you get a dialogue, or a hymn, or something like that. And only evident to you if you're paying attention to the symbols, and also the symbols make any sense to you. Because of course, the lamb that was slain, or the lamb that was slaughtered, is not only a reference to Christ on the cross, but it's also a reference to the Paschal Lamb, to Passover, to Jewish communal traditions and belief. What does God do when you're in the midst of oppression, when you're enslaved in Egypt? God sets you free, not through a battle, but protects you from destruction. Your family, the Paschal Lamb, the blood over your door, God keeps you safe from destruction and delivers you out from destruction. So he's purposefully layering on all of these Old Testament symbols, all of these Hebrew Bible symbols, so that the centurions who are reading it are just confused. Think that John's just in his old age, by now he's probably in his 90s, just think that John's gone senile and, writing nonsense. And then the people in the churches are reading this and going, he's telling us to keep the faith, to keep hope. He still believes, even though he's 90 and in prison, he still believes that Jesus' death is the thing that's going to save us, and that the power of Rome has no power. And he's so cheeky, he's sneaking letters about the destruction of Rome out underneath the noses of the centurion guards that are watching. So that's a matter of giving hope to the community as well, is that because if the guards figure it out, right? If they figure out what he's doing, well, they don't have to keep him alive. They don't have to keep him in exile. They killed the other 11 apostles, they're perfectly willing to do that. So, John writing these messages is showing he's not afraid, showing that he still believes, and the community still believes after. Revelation has a dramatic ending in 21. 19, 20, and 21 have the sort of texts which reveal how things are going to be in the end of these things. Notably, right before 21, in chapter 20, there is a depiction of the martyrs. So there is an altar, and there's said to be, the blood of the martyrs under the altar. And you can hear the voices of the martyrs saying, "How long, O Lord?" in this passage. So he's writing to the communities whose primary theological question is, how long do we have to keep enduring like this? How long do we have to keep being brave in the face of death and the power of Rome? And he's answering, and in this, he answers it with 21 here, where he says he sees a new heaven and a new earth coming down from heaven, and describes it, new city coming down, and that God has destroyed the power of death, wiped away all tears. There will be no more sorrow, no more crying, no more mourning. All of the faithful dead are raised in community and live in this new community, this new vision of New Jerusalem. At the center of the vision of this New Jerusalem, there is no palace, there is no temple, there are no walls, and there are no gates. In other words, there's no need to defend yourself from enemies from outside. There is no hierarchy. There's no people at the top and people at the bottom. And there's also no religious intermediaries, no temple, no place of worship that is apart from everything else, because the entire community is the temple. The worship is all in all, and God's presence is manifest and physical in the midst of the people as light in the city itself. So his understanding, or his description, highly metaphorical description, is a description of essentially a world where there's no empires. There's no Rome, there's no enemies, there's no wars, there's no domination, there's no rich and no poor, and that everyone lives the way Paul is trying to tell the people in those letters they're supposed to live, right? Everyone lives where if you have resources, you give them to the community and they're shared among the community. And everyone lives, where there's no courts to arbitrate disputes, because the disputes are arbitrated just among each other in the community and the people that's there. It's a highly idealized vision, and yet it's essentially a statement that this vision of community is going to beat Rome's vision of community. Our vision of community is a vision of community where people are equals with each other, and Rome's vision of a community is a vision entirely determined from the top down. The emperor is on top, and then below him is the next tier, and below him is the next tier, and then below him is the next tier, and that same structure is what you replicate in your household. You have a pater familias, you have a head of household. He alone has citizenship, has standing in court, has power and wealth and ownership, and everything depends on him. Everyone else has to please him in order to be able to stay safe and healthy and well, to live in a home as part of that. This is Rome's view of the world. And John is basically saying, after it's all said and done, there won't be anything left of Rome's view of the world. There won't be any power structures like that.
Okay.
So it's going to be just a spiritual energy, physical stuff.
I mean, it's purposefully, an idealized future, right? Like, I don't know. I think that usually where Christians go wrong is when they try to make this into something literal, when they try to imagine a specific exact thing that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. John was not writing for 2,000 years from his time. Mm-hmm. He was writing to a community of people right then, who right then were dealing with Roman centurions having power of life and death over them, and telling them right then that it's going to be okay, that ultimately God's plan for the world is a plan where we're free and equal and there's no more dominance.
So when did it start, when did Revelation start to get tied in with the turmoil that's now going on in Israel? I got a very conservative, born-again Christian cousin. Well, this is the end of times now. It's in Revelation. It was predicted in Revelation what's going on in Israel. And I'm like, oh, is it?
Yeah. Right.
I don't see it, but that's the way a lot of group interprets it.
Beautiful. Excellent question. So yeah, let's.
When did that get started? Or has it always been there?
No, recent, very, very good question. So We could definitely do whole classes on some of these things. But in the spirit of today's attempting to give a big overview, and I appreciate everyone's willingness to go along with like it was very ambitious trying to do, let's talk about the entire context of the whole New Testament in 3 hours. But, so that question that those Christians had around the year 100 of like, how long? It didn't get answered right away. It was a long time, and still is. Still now, there are still people right now who are living in oppressive circumstances, so many people living in oppressive circumstances, who if they look at the New Testament vision for what God is planning through God's community and kingdom, justly and rightly would say, how long, God? Like this, 2,000 years later, you still haven't gotten rid of hierarchy. 2,000 years later, you still haven't gotten rid of war. You still haven't gotten rid of economic oppression, right? So that question of how long often has led, at different times in history, communities to say, I have the answer, I know. Because, of course, if I have the answer, then that's a great way to get people to want to listen to me. If it's not very persuasive for me to stand up here, and which is, why I pastor two lovely, wonderful, small communities, but small communities, because it's not very persuasive to stand up and say, I don't know. I don't have an answer. God's working in the way God works, and it's going to be a long time, or it's going to be continued. We have to continue to live in faith. That's not particularly great. People would much rather have someone tell them, I know, and I can tell you. And here's what it is. Here's the answer. It's going to happen on May 15th, 2026 at 3 o'clock in the morning. This is a thing. There's lots of people who are doing that, okay? So just because there's lots of people who are doing it, I don't want to just say it's just sort of generalized. There is a specific trend of this, however, in American religious practice that came about in the 19th century, in the mid-1800s, that is what we call dominionism. It is a particular branch of theology. Dominionism holds and believes that the whole New Testament, in fact, the whole Bible, is actually like a secret code, and that if you can crack that secret code, that there's secret knowledge in here that tells you exactly what's going to happen, not just in the past and in the present and in the future, and that. We call this theological branch dominionism because it typically refers to the world as being divided into dominions or periods of time, and that they were structured by certain principles. Like God there was the period from creation to Noah, which is like the primordial dominion, and then there was the period from Noah to Abraham, which was like the beginning of human civilization, and then from Abraham to Israel or something. Like you go through, like they break history into eras, into periods, and they would say that we are in a dominion, a period, and that when this dominion ends, because naturally, whenever anyone says this, we're always in the most important, last dominion, always.
Yeah.
That we're in the last one, and it's about to end, and when it ends, finally, this is going to happen. All these things that we think are going to happen is there. And here are the signs and ways you can know and predict that that is true. This kind of theology, dominionism, has invented concepts which are nowhere found in Scripture and not historically based in the communities that wrote them, but purely based in a kind of magical thinking, a wish fulfillment, desire to have control over a chaotic world, a world that seems scary and chaotic, and it would be nice if there were a roadmap that could tell us exactly what we need to know to get to the good result that we want to get to. For example, you've probably all heard of the rapture. The word rapture does not appear anywhere in this book.
Okay,
There is no such thing.
I was wondering about that.
There is no such thing.
I've heard
It
that brought up.
is an invention of a man named Schofield, or not Schofield, I have to look up his text. 1870s, he came up with this idea that there was going to be a time that God was going to pick all of the faithful believers and take them out of earth, and the unfaithful ones get left behind, and all the bad stuff happens to them. So you've probably heard of being Left Behind, or the Left Behind novels or series.
People are disappearing.
Yeah, where people are disappearing or things like that. It's just not in here. I'm just like, there's sometimes I would be like, oh, I can see where they're getting that from. It's not a good idea, but it's just literally not in here. It's entirely added fictionally to the text as a way to try to describe things. Now, of course, when they do that, they do use texts like Revelation, which do have a lot of metaphor and narrative and crazy stuff like dragons and stuff in them. And so they do borrow from those texts and then say, that's what we're talking about when we're there. But the word rapture isn't in Revelation. The idea of believers being sucked up to heaven and other people being left behind, that's not in here. The idea that that God is going to destroy the world in fire, that's not in here. Now, they do borrow from concepts. There is a lake of fire in Revelation, and there are things thrown into the lake of fire. The things that are thrown into the lake of fire are death and Satan and war.
Good.
Not people. Things that destroy people. And so, yes, there's imagery which is destructive in here, but it's used metaphorically to refer to the destruction of powers of destruction. Similarly to the way that some of our hymns and stuff talk about Christ destroying death or Christ killing death. It's a way of theologically describing Christ unveiling for us a world in which death no longer rules, in which death no longer dominates the world. But if taken in a way that is meant to then imply literally there's some person out there who is a servant of death, or a person who embodies death, and we're supposed to go kill that person, or those people, that's a bad theological take on a text that's trying to help people escape from oppression.
So there.
So there. Now, what does this have to do with Israel? And again, we could do a whole nother class, and today's probably not time for that. Certainly not time, because we're at our time. As there, evangelical Christians in America have had a form of Christian Zionism, which is a religious belief, essentially, that in order for this sort of end time thing to happen, there has to be certain events have to happen in Israel, in the territory, the physical land of Israel. That is because in Revelation and some of these other texts, the places that are mentioned are naturally the places where these people are from, which is, Israel or Palestine. So when he's talking about events happening, he often refers to physical places in those places. And they have taken those physical place names and those historical circumstances and then shifted them 2,000 years into the present moment and said, well, God's gonna destroy all the unbelievers, and it's gonna start with a battle in this particular place in Israel. So some Christians believe, and I don't want to mince words about this, this is not just bad theology, this is I would say anti-Christian theology. Some Christians believe that by trying to promote the nation state of Israel's military rise, they will provoke those battles which will bring about the rapture and the end of the world, which they hope will take them to heaven. Notably, these people are not pro-Jewish because they believe Jewish people are all going to go to hell. They're not supportive of Jewish freedom and liberation. They are supportive of a war happening in Israel, which will, to their minds, trigger an end times result
Okay.
that are part of that. And politically, that can sometimes look like being pro-Israel because they believe that's a pathway to getting this war to happen. But that isn't the same thing as being supportive of Jewish people.
Kind of hypocritical since Jesus was a Jew.
Yes. Yeah.
You know?
So
Oh, Lord.
my intent today was to try to offer some context to how these things came, how these texts got written, and what the theology of the church was, with a particular lens. Because I think that the uniting, or one of the most prominent uniting themes of these texts, is a community that was trying to deal with their imperial oppression of Rome. They were trying to figure out how to live in this situation. So for Paul, that meant figuring out how to avoid Roman notice, how to avoid Roman oppression, how to stay under the radar and survive while carving out a space for a community that can live in a different way, where women are equal, where property is shared, where we don't go to the courts and the legions to execute justice. For the Christians of the 70s and 80s, this meant seeing Jesus himself as a prophet predicting the end of Rome through symbolic overturning of their power of death, through defeating the power of death by love and using that. And then for the Christians later in the 90s and early hundreds, it was trying to ask this question of how long they had to wait for God to finally end this Roman dominance, and using metaphor and symbol as a way to describe how God was still moving in the world, still trying to overturn Rome, but doing so in ways that were hidden from Roman understanding, and using those symbols for that purpose. Those texts are our New Testament. And so when we read them 2,000 years later, we don't share the same context identically, right? Like, we don't live under Roman imperial rule. But we do live in a world where the power of death is still prominent, where many in our society and in our world still operate as though the way that the world works is there's some at the top and some at the bottom, and it has to be that way. And that the main tool for building human society and culture is the sword, or the military, or violence. We still have some similar dynamics, and so these texts remain influential and relevant, not just because of their religious significance, but because they continue to teach truths. They continue to encourage people to have hope, even when the world seems a desperate place. They continue to show people how, without taking up the tools of violence, you can defeat violence. They show how living without a fear of death can free you into seeing a new way of being and a community that is ultimately, I believe, as a Christian, the form of human community that is going to last, that is going to work. I think if human beings want to live on this planet for a long time and live well with each other, we have to learn how to live with love of neighbor, because I promise you that nuclear arms and ecocide and global destruction and military dominance and such, and mining out every single scrap of every single ore and every single valuable resource from the earth is not going to be the path to flourishing.
Right.
So these texts are relevant for helping us to understand that in that way. And I hope that maybe offered some help too.
I have a question about John the Baptist. He was not one of the original apostles?
No, John the Baptist was one of Jesus's teachers, mentors. He preceded Jesus, so.
It was Elizabeth's son.
Yes, he was, in Luke's narrative, John is Jesus's cousin, kind of. They're related, but he's older than Jesus, and Jesus he teaches Jesus. He's not one of Jesus'
Yeah,
students.
so this John is a brother of somebody.
Oh, the John who wrote Revelation?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many Johns. The historians aren't 100% sure. Probably he's the same John who wrote 1st and 2nd John, the letters, but not the John who wrote the Gospel. The Gospel John is probably a different John. Is there?
Okay, thank you.
All right, if anyone else had any more questions at any point, please feel free, but I want to honor your time. We're already a little bit over, so those of you who came today, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you're able to help
Thank you
with any
very
cleanup or anything, that's great. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you
much.
tomorrow.
Tomorrow.